Paracha. Dr. Paracha is a senior government official and public policy expert of governance, public finance, and decentralization. His research focuses on property tax collection. He was the WTO ambassador and was also secretary industries for the government of Punjab. Please proceed with the session, Dr. Paracha.
Thank you very much. Could you please get back to the conference? We think it will require also. So this session, the first paper is about titled Keeping the Enemies Closer, exporting behavior of firms in conflict, presented by Zara Yacob of Wilfred Laurier University. And the discussant for this paper is Nida Jamil. So Zara, over to you, please.
So I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for doing such an amazing talk. It's really nice to connect with people who are passionate about the same things as you are. So thank you for giving me a chance to present my work here today. This is joint work with Gerard Hussain, and although we have presented the paper before, this is the first time I'm presenting in Pakistan, and that changes a few things because the audience is relatively more informed about the conflict, India-Pakistan conflict. So I'm excited to hear some of your comments, especially in addressing some of the results that we get. All right, so there's a vast literature that explores the plausibility of the relationship between war, conflict, terrorist incidents, and international trade. The idea here is that a terrorist incident not only has direct economic cost by, for example, damaging infrastructure, but there's also indirect economic cost in the form of higher risk, higher uncertainty, steering resources to implement necessary response measures, and then this erosion of social infrastructure or the goodwill, the trust that takes very long to build. So because of both of these reasons, there's a rise in transaction cost of trade, which results in slowing down the flow of goods across the border. This paper looks at So in this paper, we investigate the effects of a terrorist incident on trade patterns of firms exporting to a terror-affected country. And our focus here is on the differential microeconomic impact on firms as a result of this terrorist attack. So we use the attack on an army base in India, so you may remember, in Uri, on September 18, 2016, and exploit the sudden, large, unanticipated nature of the attack and how it impacted firms. And again, and more importantly for our study against the backdrop of stable macroeconomic, relatively stable macroeconomic environment. And we complement this setting with using administrative data from Pakistan. So we use data from Pakistani exporting companies from 2015 to 2017. That gives us at least a year worth of observations before and after the attack. Our setup is unique. India and Pakistan used for a long time, were important trade partners for each other. And given the historical and institutional context. They are two largest economies in South Asia. They share common culture, common border, common history. Just recently celebrated almost common Independence Day. So even though recently, if you look at the recent numbers, trade has sort of declined, but in 2016, India was still an important trade partner for Pakistan. So this is the big picture. After the attack, we see that there is a drop in total exports to India, and we see a similar drop in the share of Indian exports. But then things pick up very soon. Within 2 to 3 months of the attack, we don't see much in the aggregate data. So throughout the paper, we make this case that we look at individual firms and product lines. And this was not the case for individual firms or certain product categories or different shipping locations that were used to ship goods to India. So this picture here shows a sharp drop in the median change in firm level exports after the attack. And then if you look at certain product categories, I won't show it here, but you will see that some product lines were more affected compared to others. So the key finding here is that firms do respond significantly to terrorist attacks. In particular, there is 6.6 percentage points lower average growth after the shock, and we see similar declines in export quantity as well as unit value of exports. There are also interesting changes on the extensive margins measured by the number of product lines that were shipped to India, as well as in terms of firm entry and exit. We don't see much happening. And then we spend a lot of time on heterogeneity analysis, really exploiting the richness of the data that we have. And this is the most interesting part of the paper. And I probably won't have time to cover everything, but I really mentioned important results. Not all firms were impacted the same way. And there are some other interesting results in terms of elasticity of substitution, the import demand in the Indian market that we can talk about. This is the literature, so it's not a new topic. Our study resembles the last one's here, which is more disaggregated data. So, despite all the social, economic, political tensions between the two countries, India was Pakistan's most important trade partner, one of the most important trade partners for a long time. But regardless, there's a large number of non-direct barriers which still continue to hinder trade. And then every time there's something like this, a terrorist attack or a conflict of similar nature, it jeopardizes the progress already made, like this one did. So the Uri attack took place in Barmula, which is Indian district Kashmir, about 10 kilometers east of the line of control. According to the BBC, it was the deadliest attack on security forces in Kashmir in 2 decades, and it had immediate consequences. Mainstream media in both countries engaged in angry rhetoric right after the attack. India decided to cancel participation in the upcoming SARC summit. So it was a big deal. We used the data, administrative data compiled by the FBR in Pakistan. This is very comprehensive information on the universe of import and export transactions from Pakistan to India. So for this paper, we look at only exports, although we do use information on imports from India as well. So we have a lot of detail on the 8-digit product category that was imported, shipping locations, and about 9% of the sample firms here also, I should say the universe of firms, export to India. And I have some examples in case you're wondering what the type of goods Pakistan exports to India. I recently heard that designer lawns are also being popular in India, plates and some other goods, as we know. So the identification strategy is motivated by some earlier studies using different event study design, and we conduct a number of robustness tests, including placebo tests where we replace India and other countries, and make sure, in the paper we show that the effect is not mitigated by confounders. So if you look at GDP or inflation data from India, it just follows the trend here. Okay, so this is the main empirical specification that we use. We start with a more aggregated setup where we have firm country level estimation. X is the primary dependent variable, so that is exports value, exports quantity, as well as unit value. And then we also use the FOB value to measure unit value as well as quantity and weight. So all that information is available in the data. So log difference change in exports, and then beta is the primary coefficient of interest that will tell us the change in the growth rate of exports for these Pakistani firms to India after the attack relative to the control group countries, which is the rest of the world. So that's what we find. The first two columns are for exports value, and the next two are exports units, quantity measured by number of units in weight, and then the last two columns is for unit value. We see a persistently negative impact in growth rates for these firms exporting to India on average, and we see similar results if we collapse the data at firm, project, country, board levels. That's the highest level of disaggregation that we use. Using alternative specifications, we can see the results, and then also restricting the sample to only the firms that are exporting to India as well as other countries. Right, so I think I already mentioned this. We try a number of robustness tests. Let me spend some time on heterogeneity analysis. So in the paper, we look at heterogeneous analysis across firms, products, and shipping locations. I just mentioned four interesting ones. So the first one here is an indicator variable equal to 1. So the idea is we just want to see whether firm size mattered, okay, whether or not the impact was larger for smaller firms compared to bigger firms. So the three-way interaction from beta 2 is what we're interested in. The answer is yes. Pure exporters are the firms that were only exporting and had zero domestic sales did indeed suffer the most as a result of the attack. On the other hand, and very interestingly, there are some winners that emerged as a result of this conflict. So these are the larger firms, which are also importing from India. We see positive and significant coefficient, which is different from the results that I have shown earlier. How do we interpret these findings? It can be sort of referred to the literature, the trade, global firm-to-firm networks, and international trade. So this shows that maybe we have these big firms, which are also importing from India, the well-connected, well-established Pakistani firms, which superstar firms, according to the literature, which were able, so firms were able to bear the brunt of the attack. How did they do that? Well, so one possible explanation is because of the risk management. Because, okay, so think of this as the Indian buyers who are buying from India. Because of the greater risk associated with buying from smaller firms, who can now maybe not bear the cost of shipping goods to alternative locations, as I will show in the next slide. Okay? In the face of higher uncertainty, there's a shift in demand towards products sold by larger firms. Okay? About the shipping locations, we see a variation in results. So this is also very interesting. The eastern border is closer to Uri, the location of the attack. So based on the proximity of the shipping location to India, from the location of the attack, we see a differential effect. There's a variation effect across shipping locations. So if you look at Lahore versus Karachi ports, there is a decline in export value, quantity, and unit values. There's a decline in exports shipped to Lahore, but there is a rise in exports going from Karachi to the southern border. Okay, so once again, this is indicative of, you think of this as there's long waiting lines at the border. There's anecdotal evidence that shows that trucks were waiting for a long time at the Atari-Wagah border. And so once again, those larger firms who could bear the cost of rerouting their shipments away from Lahore towards Karachi were the ones who actually benefited and could afford to bear that transaction cost. Just to conclude, what we find is that firms do respond significantly to a terrorism shock, even though we don't have a nice drop in the aggregate data, and things do seem to pick up soon after. But I think this is one of the more important contributions of the paper, that there is significant amount of heterogeneity in responses across firms, products, and shipping locations. If you think of this, the policy implications of our findings, there is an important role for governments and policy makers in contain the media and the general public engaging in that obvious expression of hostility that's rooted in the expression, and attempt to project more confidence in resuming economic activity. Now, more generally, at least through the conversations that I've had with people who have worked on India-Pakistan trade for a long time, they seem very pessimistic about the future of India-Pakistan trade relationship. As a proponent of free trade, I believe that there is greater political and economic stability can bring about wide-ranging benefits to consumers and businesses in both countries, and Pakistan has a lot more to gain given the relatively smaller size. So on that positive note, I will conclude and look forward to your questions after the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to Milana for some remarks, and hopefully we have time for a few questions after.
Thank you, Zara. I really enjoyed the presentation and reading the paper. So, just a very quick summary. So, the paper looks at the effect of a major terrorist attack in India in 2016 as a quasi-analytic experiment on various outcomes across firms, product lines, looking at both intensive and extensive margins. The main contribution is that this is a study that looks at provides micro-level evidence. In most cases, when you look at literature that's based on terrorism, the effect is more like an FDI or macro kind of analysis. And the other thing that is really nice is that this paper looks at the short-term impact. So Zara has data a year before the attack and a year after the attack, so just sort of like a short-term analysis. And it focuses on a single attack, while most of the literature focuses on an ongoing war. So a lot of literature on Ukraine, Russia, an ongoing war, but this focuses on a single attack. And of course, it covers the underlying mechanisms of how firms respond to an attack. So things I really like about the study, and as Zara said, that this is a Pakistani audience that's not just only more familiar in terms of India and Pakistan, but I think we're more excited to be in a cricket match or in India-Pakistan research. I think we are interested. So it looks at trade between two so-called enemies, neighboring countries, developing countries. So it's interesting in that context. And the other thing that I really like about this paper is that how with limited data you've written an entire paper, which is really nice. Because even in the study that I'm going to present, Dr. Teresa, Dr. Azam and I, we've been working with a similar customs data, and we've been just able to extract like information regarding the destination and export value, but just writing an entire paper with this kind of data is something that I think is really exciting. And I think some of the results are really cool. So for example, normally one would perceive that everyone loses on both ends, right, if there's a war. But seeing that even in Pakistan there's some firms gain like large firms and some firms lose, small firms, it's interesting. And I know this is like beyond the scope of your paper, but I was then thinking about some resource reallocation that would have taken place as a result of it. So I think even from this result, many other interesting questions would sort of come up. And even the result that firms then sort of move away from exporting to the hard port to Karachi port is something really interesting. Okay, so some comments. I know this is sort of like between Pakistan and India, any countries that are neighboring and that are in conflict kind of thing. It's always sort of very difficult to have something, a shock that is truly unanticipated and exogenous. And that is something that we say is required for your strategy. So my comment was that you're taking the Uri attack, but just a few months before that we had the Pathankot attack, which was quite similar. So like it was by the same militant groups, Islamic terrorists, United Jihad Council, the same suspect that was there. And sources say again this was a militant attack, right? It was more or less the same kind of very close location. And the militants claimed that this was the attack that sort of was like a breaking point in relationships. And even last year, so the same suspect was for the Pathankot attack, for the Uri attack, he was actually murdered, I think, in 2023. And they referred to him by saying that he was a suspect of the Pathankot attack. So I was just thinking that because you have the data, and why are you not looking at the Pathankot attack? And if this because this took place a few months ago. If your the URI attack would exactly be endogenous, so that's the idea. And as you can see that these two events were shockingly very similar in nature. So I mean, I was thinking about how do you justify the attack being sort of completely unanticipated when a similar attack took place a few months ago and then it wasn't. And then even I was thinking that even if the attack is, let's say, unanticipated, but then I was thinking that I mean, figure 1 in the paper that I got and figure 3 in what you presented right now, why were you not seeing in January 2016, if these attacks are very similar, why were you not seeing sort of a dip in the exports, right? So if these attacks are very similar, even if they are unanticipated, then you should be seeing similar dips if the economic channels are working and the firms are sort of reacting in the same way. So I thought it's something that you may want to consider. And again, coming back to my point, between January and September, there were multiple attacks. So I have 2 other attacks that I've written that were actually within this time period. So just thinking about how to explain more of that. The other thing is, I think it would be interesting if you add in a post-2016 dummy, and it would be interesting to see if this interaction is still significant. So maybe that's one of the things that we can do. The other thing is, I was a bit confused on this point. So how you are referring to firms as the losers are the smaller firms, and typically in literature we define small firms in terms of the inputs, right? So firm size in terms of labor or capital or the input. But you don't have this data. What you're doing is you are defining small firms as the export share, and according to your definition, a small exporting firm is that firm that sells only in the international market with no domestic sales. So for these firms, that means if you're taking the export share is 100%, right? So if you're measuring the size of the firms with the export share, wouldn't a larger firm be a firm with a greater export share? And these firms have 100% export share. So I was a bit confused on how you're defining it. And the more you export, typically in literature, the more you export, the greater the export share, the more productive you are. It's linked with learning by exporting and other channels of productivity. So if the small firms, according to your definition, with 100% export share are losing out, are we saying that more productive firms are losing out? I was a bit confused with this. And of course, I mean, since we don't have the data, but I was thinking that one way would be to check if these small firms are more import intensive. If they are, then they will most probably be more productive. So just a bit confused about the definition. And just some additional points, we did talk about this during tea, that we look at some impacts on the imports, not just Pakistan's exports, but how we are also retaliating. And then also, you do mention elasticities, but looking at something about the top exporting products for Pakistan to India, the results are low. And maybe controlling for the number of destinations. You do look at the firms that are exporting for the SAARC countries, but maybe you're not looking at firms exporting to the United States and the European Union. Their margin costs and their markups, how they change might be different. But yeah, thank you. But otherwise, I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
So, before you answer, can we just take a quick question, 1 or 2 from the floor, and then we don't have that much time. Please.
Hi. Very innovative approach using Fourier dynamic as a shock, and it's well in line with the policy discussion that in India we have in recent years. So some of these reports in export have some seasonality. So I wanted to ask if you have control for season-specific effects. And secondly, sorry if I missed this, but what's the framework of this COSI experiment? I mean, what are the control groups here? And if it's just Pakistan and India, have you considered exploring this continuity as a methodology to estimate that sequence? Thank you.
All right. So uncertainty in general. There were other attacks. There was general hostility environment, hostile environment at the time. We focused on this one for the reason that it was the largest. We could certainly try looking at other incidents, and we haven't done that yet, but we could see whether we see similar effects. I think that doesn't make this one less important, so we could try that. The other thing is, so this was number one largest, and then also our argument here was that in that period of heightened uncertainty, where the Indian government is spending so much on security, one wouldn't expect such a large-scale attack on a highly secured location. So the idea of attacking, according to the literature, military base or army headquarters is that you want to maximize the psychological damage and the physical damage through a single event. So we look at the largest for that reason. But yes, we could try at least for robustness purposes to see what's happening with the other attacks. I think I wasn't very clear on the definition of pure exporters, so that's my bad. So this is based on a different paper that also uses the same data, where we define pure exporters, use the word that's conventionally used in the literature to define pure exporting firms as the ones that are only exporting. So they have zero domestic sales. So that's the proxy we are using for small exporters, because in that paper we show that these pure exporter firms are significantly smaller in size. They export to fewer countries, import from fewer countries, and on average export lower value added goods, so unit value is lower. So we cite the paper, and therefore in the presentation I didn't have the time to elaborate on the definition. But you're right, export share would be 100%, that's fine. Another hurdle here is we don't have access to firm level data. We only know how much they're buying or selling, so it's just the transaction level data. So this is just our proxy for size. And that's where we see, and that's what we conclude, that the average effects hide a lot of variation across different firms, and it's the smaller firms and a lot of these pure exporting firms that were affected. All right, about imports. So we always get that comment, why don't you look at imports? I think that's for a different paper, but we haven't done that yet. If we look at the aggregate picture for imports, it's very funny. It goes up and down, and this is the problem with Pakistan-India aggregate trade numbers. It's very noisy. We don't see much. There's a dip, and like you mentioned, there's a drop, big and small, for all of those attacks, and then things pick up. That's the relationship India-Pakistan have always had in terms of trade. Except, 2019 onwards, there's a sharp decline, and we don't see things recovering, which is kind of sad. So, yes, we haven't done imports. We do make use of the import data for heterogeneity analysis, but that's certainly something we could try. I also like your point about focusing on certain product categories, and while you were explaining this, I got another idea. Why not focus on certain products which are maybe food items or perishable items? So you mentioned top 10 exporting goods, so you could restrict the sample and see maybe bigger impact for those product lines. The product level analysis that we do in the paper as of now is based on import elasticity of demand. There's interesting results about product differentiation, where you see bigger impact on the less differentiated products. Okay? Seasonality effects. So yes, we control for time fixed effects. We tried everything for at monthly as well as quarterly level of aggregation. This relates to your point about using post-2016 dummy. The only thing is that in that case we only have 3 years of data, so we're trying to fully exploit the more finely granular level available to us. But yes, we do control for seasonality in all the estimation results that I showed, and also the interaction fixed effects, the product time fixed effects, we control for unobserved patterns at the product time level. All right, there was one last point about treatment and control. So treatment firms are the firms that export to India, and control are ones that are not exporting to India, exporting to other countries. But then in the restricted sample that I showed, we only focus on the firms which are exporting to both, so India as well as other countries. So the definition changes a little bit, but for the baseline estimation, it's India
now on to Nilay Sweet, who is presenting a paper titled Trade Liberalization Missions, Worldwide Evidence from Pakistan. And the discussion for this is Philip Bhartasman. Please. If you could limit to about 15 minutes plus, then we have more time for discussion.
Thank you. So this is a complete work in progress, so all suggestions come as welcome. To trade liberalization and carbon emissions, firmly with evidence in Pakistan, and my co-authors, Dr. Rajat Chaudhary and Dr. Ahmed. So climate change, of course, is a global issue, and trade accounts for 20 to 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions, and particularly with resources and energy being used at every stage of the manufacturing process, which leading to notable rise in CO2 emissions, and with climate change being such a big issue now. So there's always this need of having more efficient ways of production, and how important this is, and how we link, how important it is to link climate with exports. It could be seen that in a period when China was booming around 2010, around 25% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions they came from China. So this is like how important this is in terms of linking trade and carbon dioxide emissions. So the impact of trade on carbon emissions through exporting firms can be grouped into three categories. So the first one is a scale effect. That simply means you're producing more in order to export. You're producing more, and because you're producing more, you're emitting more. So that's purely just because of the output. The second one is the technological or the technique effect. That simply means that if firms invest more in better technology or in energy efficient technologies, emissions per unit would go down. So this is the first one is a positive relationship, the second one sort of is a negative relationship. The third one is a composition effect. That is when firms change their product mix. It could go in either directions, right? It basically, if firms move towards more cleaner products, emission intensity would go down. If they move towards more dirty product, it would go up. And literature suggests that if they move towards the core concentrated products, then emission intensity should go down. So what we do is we look at the impact of two exogenous foreign demand shocks on firm level emissions, and the reason mainly why we look at two different shocks is because we focus on the textile sector, and during the same time period, the Pakistani textile sector was exposed to two different exogenous shocks, just to get the entire picture. So we have the first shock, that's the Pakistan-China Free Trade Agreement in 2006, and then the second shock is the end of the Multi-Fiber Agreement. I'll quickly go over just some introduction, just a brief idea of what this is. So Pakistan-China FTA, this is mainly linked with tariffs, where tariffs were reduced on both sides. And we can clearly see that it was more in favor of China, where the trade deficit for Pakistan increased over the years. What we do is, taking the textile sector, we divide the textile sector into four segments: spinning, finishing, clothing, and interior. And we can clearly see that the tariff rates that China, first graph, tariff rates that China had imposed on Pakistani products during this time period, I've considered the analysis from 2010, the least protected segments were the low value added segments, that is spinning and finishing. And clearly what Pakistan is exporting to China are low value added products, that's mainly the spinning. The end of the Multi-Fiber Agreement. So this was another exogenous shock that Pakistan textile industry faced. So the Multi-Fiber Agreement had set quantity restrictions or quotas on the quantity of textiles and clothing that developing countries could export to developed countries, and the aim was to protect local industries. Now, although the MFA was signed in 1974, it basically originates back to the 1930s when the US and the European Union had sort of restricted imports from Japan. But later on, instead of these restrictions being removed, they were sort of extended to other countries, including Pakistan. And then first they were on cotton, but ultimately all kinds of textiles and clothing were included in this quantity restriction. This was actually sort of removed when the textiles came under the General Agreement on Tariffs on Trade under the WTO, where an attempt was made to remove these restrictions, and it was done in four different phases with a complete elimination of these quotas by January 2005. Now, how this is different from the FTA is because FTA was just between Pakistan and China. In this case, at the end of the multi-fiber agreement, these restrictions were removed, but not just for Pakistan, but for the entire world, for the rest of the world as well. So in other words, this is something that affected not just Pakistan at the same time, but the entire world. So Pakistan faced a lot of competition as a result of it, because other countries also got access. So the first graph in this is the fill rate. That measures how basically how restricted the quotas are, and the dotted line is basically 80%. So we can see that for Pakistan, for these different segments, in many cases the fill rates are above 80%. So meaning they were restrictive. And in terms of Pakistan's export to the US, we can see that mainly the focus is on high value-added segments, interior and clothing. So I'm skipping the data part, but we mainly use the sense of the manufacturing industries. We have an unbalanced balance for the years 2000, 2005, 2010. So just some initial correlations. So what we see is that as the export value increases, the output increases, and as a result, emissions increase. So we do find evidence of scale effect, right? We're producing more, the firms emit more. In terms of the concentration effect, we do find that, so that's also working. Firms, as they export more, they focus more on their core product. Quality increases. But in terms of the technique effect, or the technology effect, we do not find any significant result. So overall, it's a scale effect, and it's basically the concentration effect that's working, not the technology effect. And as a result, as firms emit more, the emission per unit goes down. But there's a problem with this. That's basically this sort of correlation is affected by mutual variable bias, and of course, in many cases, for firms that are not exporting, the export value is zero. So this is sort of distributed leftwards. As a solution, what many studies do is that they look at exogenous determinants of export, such as a foreign demand shock or any changes in trade policy. And normally, literature that looks at these demand shocks looks at foreign demand shocks. But due to data limitations, we are not able to sort of compute the foreign demand shocks. What we do instead is we compute total demand shocks, and then we use instruments to pick up the foreign effect. And we see that with these demand shocks, it's positively correlated with the export value. So, as I said, we need some more clear variables to pick up these different demand shocks. So, these different shocks. So, for the Pakistan-China FTA, we use the tariffs, because tariffs are lower. So, basically, these are the tariff rates that the typical Pakistani firm would face at the time of these. That's an indicator of the FTA. For the multi-fiber agreement, we pick its effect by using two variables. So, that is the quantity restriction that Pakistani firms face. And as I said, the key difference between both of these is that the end of the MFA gave access to the US market to the entire world at the same time as it did to Pakistan. So to get the complete picture of the MFA, we also look at the restrictions of the rest of the world. This basically generally measures the competition that Pakistani firms face in the US market. What we see is with the tariffs, so this is what this picks up the effect of the Pakistan-China FTA, and because the change in tariffs was a negative, tariffs were going down, demand shocks and export value increased for all forms of exporters. In terms of the MFA, that's how we pick up the effect in the last two variables of restriction on Pakistan and the rest of the world. We see that as the restriction in Pakistan goes down, the demand shocks and exports increase, but these are not as significant as compared to the competition. So as this competition goes down, because this is also going down, we see that the export value and demand shocks for Pakistan are actually negative. So because of foreign competition, although Pakistan does get access, but because of competition, its exports are going down and sort of a negative demand shock. Next, what we do is, in order to pick up the effect, we use, for the FTA, we use tariffs as an instrument for export value, and then we look at the impact of the predicted export value on firm level outcomes. So we see for the first stage that as tariffs go down, changing tariff is negative, export value goes up. And so this is now picking up the effect of the FTA. And as export value goes up, again, there is the scale effect. So firms that are exporting to China, they produce more and they emit more. So They do focus on their core product. They are reducing their number of product offerings, and as a result, what's happening is quality is going up. In terms of the technique effect, we don't find these firms exporting to China investing in technology, and overall emissions per unit are insignificant. So emissions are going up, but emissions per unit are insignificant. Similarly, for the end of the MFA, what we do is we use the restrictions on Pakistan and rest of the world as instruments, and then we look at the impact. From the first result, again, the own restrictions for Pakistan do not significantly impact the exports. It's basically competition, and because for the rest of the world these restrictions were going down, so as these restrictions go down, export value for Pakistan goes down. And what happens as export value for Pakistan goes down, so firms that are exporting to the US, their output goes down and the emissions go down. So they're emitting less, but it's not because they're becoming more productive, it's basically because they're producing less. They move away from their core product. Number of products is insignificant, and their quality actually goes down. So basically what's happening is that firms that are exporting to the US, they're moving away from their core products towards low quality products. There is insignificant investment in capital, and what's happening to emissions per unit is that emissions per unit are going up. So firms that are exporting to US, they're sort of exporting low quality, high emission intensity products. I'm going to skip this correlation table, but this is mainly, I have a lot of animations in this, but this is mainly confirming the results that I have shown earlier. So, in other words, while both the end of the MFA and Pakistan-China Free Trade Agreement were anticipated to give Pakistani firms more access in the US and Chinese markets, the end of the MFA failed to do so because of the competition that Pakistan faced in the US market. Therefore, overall in terms of emission intensity, the Pakistan-China Free Trade Agreement was a better deal for Pakistan because it was a positive demand shock, and firms were sort of the emissions per unit, if they did not, decrease, they were at least not increasing significantly compared to the MFA, which was a negative demand shock, and Pakistani firms were moving towards low quality, high emission intensity products. However, the gain in the Chinese market for Pakistan was not, it was basically in terms of not just the emission side, but it was also basically the gain was in terms of low value-added segment, right? So it was not that Pakistani firms are just emitting more because now they've lost the share in the US market, but also the share that they lost in the US market was basically of high value-added segments like interior and clothing. Therefore, the loss of Pakistan at the end of the MFA was more than an increase in emission intensity and quality degradation. It was basically a loss in the high value-added segments. Now, why did Pakistan lose out? As I said, Pakistan lost, like many other countries, including Philippines, Korea, Taiwan, Bangladesh, it lost its share in the US market because of competition, mainly that was coming in from China, especially after it gained access into WTO. And it just suggests that at the end of the MFA, many countries, they lost their share, and China's benefit was at the expense of other America's other trading partners rather than their local firms. And this was sort of anticipated because since China was not part of the WTO member, it was not eligible for the first two rounds of quota elimination. But upon entering the WTO, China's average exports to the US market increased by 145%, and for some product categories, the exports even increased to over 1,000%. So this is a graph that shows just after 5 years at the end of the MFA, the first panel shows for textiles and clothing the drop in Pakistan's market share, but it rise in China's market share. And if we put the dots together, therefore China gave access to Pakistan in its own markets by importing low value-added products, but in return it sort of captured the Pakistani share of high value-added products in the US market. Now, this trend is something that is not just common between Pakistan, it's not just there between Pakistan and China, but it's common for other multiple free trade agreements that China entered at the same time with other countries, including the ASEAN countries. China lowered its tariffs for intermediate inputs, and which were needed to produce high value-added outputs, giving them access access in the Chinese market and sort of capturing their high value added share in the US market. So, concluding, while various factors contribute towards China's comparative advantage, including cheap labor, low prices, development of science parks, ensuring a strategy of having a consistent supply of raw materials was something that was one of the potential contributing factors. And just between 2000 and 2006, China's import of intermediate imports increased by 256%, and the proportion of China's imports, including intermediate imports, were directly related to export demand. And this sort of demonstrates China's strategy to emerge as a global and regional, giant in the world trade. Thank you.
Philip for a discussion, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the organizers for giving me the opportunity to discuss this great paper. So let me get started. Okay, to summarize up, my understanding of what this paper is able to achieve is to make progress regarding this big question of the effect of economic growth, in particular export growth, on CO2 emissions while studying textile manufacturers in Hyundai. The policies that are being studied essentially are product-level demand shocks, for exports in particular, and those are twofold. One, the Pakistan-China Free Trade Agreement essentially corresponds to a reduction in tariffs, whereas the end of the multi-fiber agreement is an end of import quotas. So it's different there. And in this analysis in particular, the authors do a very careful job of accounting for the end of quotas also to other countries, other aspects. And then they bring these product-level demand shocks to the firm level by linking them to Firm I's share of product, the share of different product in Firm I's revenue. So the headline findings are that the lowering of tariffs due to the free trade agreement leads to higher exports and higher quality of exports, while the emissions per unit of output stays stable and total emissions go up. On the other hand, the end of the multi-fiber agreement leads to exports going down, as well as the quality of exports going down, emissions per unit of output going up, and total emissions going down. Now, so what do we learn from these results here? So first of all, they provide a better understanding of just this trade-off between growth and CO2 emissions, where with a particular focus exactly on trade, exporting, and these CO2 emissions. It is very informative to talk about this in the context of one of the most populated countries in the world. Moreover, it's really focused on this very important industry where basically all catch-up growth involved, growth of textiles in particular. And what I find particularly interesting is that you have these two types of trade liberalizations that differ in their effect on both growth and CO2 emissions. My takeaway is that both of those may go down if the effect of liberalization on competitors dominates the direct effect that perhaps we would expect from Econ 101. So what I also find very interesting is that export growth's effect on emissions differs depending on these two shocks. So the elasticity from the end of the multi-fiber agreement between export growth and output growth is 0.65, whereas that elasticity is much smaller from the free trade agreement between Pakistan and China. They are similarly significant, so you get more precision from one of those two shocks. In particular, I'm very sorry. This was the elasticity of emissions, and the next line is the elasticity of firm output rather than those emissions. So you can see again those two kind of co-moving in an interesting way. So some ideas regarding the identification that this paper is pursuing. One of them is that it feels like it might be possible to make more use of the panel nature of the data. So I don't know if, given your data, it would be possible to include firm level fixed effects or firm fixed effects. So that may or may not be possible because you only have kind of these 3 years of data, 5 years apart, each of them. But I think one dimension of data we actually have more and an aspect where you could use that more is using the textile export customs transactions database, where that might allow you to create predetermined weights for products when calculating the exposure to both the free trade agreement as well as the end of the multi-fiber agreement. So you could use that database if the CMI doesn't give you sufficient observation because you don't have enough firms that you observe in the different waves of that happening. Yet I think in this way you might be able to move much closer to kind of a shift share instrument type explanation. I think that would just bring the, it would add quite a bit to the inference. So another thing that I was thinking about is what do you know why firms drop in and out of the CMIs. I don't know enough about the data to tell you what the right conclusion is there. But if firms dropping out of the CMI, it just means that they are not exporting or not exporting at that level, then of course that tells you something, right? Zero is not just we don't know anything about this firm. And so another suggestion here to really try to, again, bring it closer to a panel is instead of using the logarithms, you might want to look into either the inverse hyperbolic sine or a PPML modeling of the outcome. And both of those might just provide some robustness, but also maybe additional insights, really, which dimension, along which dimensions are firms affected. Is it the intensive margin only? Is it intensive and extensive margin? And regarding the extensive margin, I think there are also a couple of different ways in which you could look at that. So one of them is, of course, just the likelihood to be an exporter. Another one is you could do this by product, and that would actually allow you to say some things that don't require discriminatory prediction, which may be interesting. So one other point that I thought about, and the authors will let me know whether that is something they think is interesting or feasible, is that you could look at the effect of other countries' tariffs in China. So this would essentially be equivalent to looking at the rest of the world, the effect of quantitative restrictions in the US and Europe due to the multi-fiber agreement. It seems like you could do the same potentially for other countries to China. Then you would again have kind of this competition channel to look at the effect of that. And of course, this is interesting, so that, but also it's potentially a limited variable. So there is potential for limited variable bias, right? So of course, the tariffs that you measure, they are specific to Pakistan, but on the other hand, they may be correlated with the tariffs that China imposes on other countries, empirically measured. But in particular, you mentioned that China was also pursuing these free trade agreements with some of the ASEAN countries, and I don't know how, if China is being super strategic about it, you would think that potentially they are shaping tariffs in the same way, whether they're talking to Pakistan or some of the ASEAN countries. So then I had some more thoughts regarding the instrumental variables, or regarding thinking about these trade agreements or trade liberalizations as instruments for export growth. So my interpretation is that perhaps they are not instruments for export growth writ large, but maybe you can think about what kind of export growth you get from the two different instruments. And the first one is that so basically the free trade agreement with China, what that does is it in the first stage affects exports to China, right? Whereas the multi-fiber agreement in the first stage affects exports to the US and Europe, where both of these may have impacts on Pakistan's exports to third countries. But if that is the case, I would think that the most plausible argument is that this happens only because in the first stage exports to China or the US and Europe are being affected. So you could be a bit more precise, and I think that gives you some pretty interesting insights, because those are different kinds of exports that you get, right? And I think you're basically there. It's just a way of rephrasing what you have, and I think there are some larger things to be learned by doing so. So I think there are three ways in which this paper links to other big questions that could be further emphasized. So the first one is to what extent textile exports are emissions efficient in raising development outcomes in Pakistan. And so there I would like to say a bit more about, so basically you're comparing the emissions intensity of different kinds of exports, but perhaps there are other potential counterfactuals, right? So first of all, there could be exports of things other than textiles, the domestic sales, etc. And yeah, so I think it would be interesting to know, this may be just back of the envelope stuff, but to understand really what your results are telling us, I think it would be nice to think about the effects on GDP, number of jobs from other types of economic activities. And the second one here is kind of thinking more globally. Let's say you are interested in producing a given amount of textiles. Is textile production in Pakistan emissions efficient compared to production in country X? So there basically, I think this was either in the introduction of your paper or in the Barros-Olivier paper that you cited extensively. Basically one argument that I guess is, or one discussion that developed countries are having is to what extent kind of importing increases or decreases overall emissions. And yeah, this is something that you could focus on, point number one. And to wrap up, let me just say the last thing. I do think one of the most interesting things is here the differences in effects of kind of selling low value added inputs into kind of a competitive global value chain. So this would be the free trade agreement with China, or selling a high value added product to a somewhat protected market, which would be the US and Europe prior to the end of the multi-fiber agreement. Your idea results suggest that exports of type A lead to more output and emissions than exports of type B, but both of them lead kind of similar emissions efficiencies. And yeah, so I mean there's something interesting to use that regard. Yeah. So thank you for the opportunity of reading this great paper.
Thank you, Philip. Insightful. Before just a couple of comments. 30 years ago, I had a master's thesis on MFA, the Pakistani textile industry. But from my experience of WTO, see, carbon water addition mechanisms and application. So it's a very opportune paper to look at this kind of sort of relationship. The other important sort of aspect of this paper is following the underlying view of sort of reflect is the trade and growth strategy followed by China, or you say industry strategy making, and the value of that, which EU and the US are also finding out very quickly. For points for you to consider is the availability of credit, essentially credit of PMR, which is cyclical for textile industry in Pakistan. I know 80s was the period where they invested more in capital and new technology, and just look at the history of that. For me, an important point had been looking at the MFA and its impact in Pakistani textile industry was that quotas inevitably threw up rents, and a lot of these firms went into rent seeking rather than actual improvements in technology or investment or anything else that put them up on the CO2 chart. So just a couple of points there. The floor is open for any questions, please.
Within this clarification question, I might have missed it. How do you construct your key variable is emission parameter and which data set is used and how good is the construct? This one thing I would also start into is again for understanding what do you mean by log of quality? So I don't know, is it the products you define them as the quality products and then you take them off?
Thank you for the comments and suggestions. So for the firm fixed effects, yes, we can definitely do that. I think we're already, the reason why we do not include so many fixed effects is we already have the product fixed effects, we have the segment fixed effects, we have the segment line fixed effects. So that was one of the reasons. Then your comment for the weights for exposure to the FTA using the customs data. You're right, and we did think about this, and we've been struggling because the customs data that we have is from 2010, and those product codes are not very carefully constructed. That's basically the quality of the data for the product codes. So we've been struggling with it since many years, but I mean, up to now we're not successful in it. But if we are able to, I think this is definitely one point that we should consider. So I totally agree. With the firms moving in and out, if they're exiting, basically it's an unbalanced panel. So if a firm is not in the CMI, we cannot say for sure that it is exiting. So I mean, I think if it might be incorrect to assume that firm is entering or exiting until just because it's an unbalanced panel. We don't have any question when it went to the market. In terms of your suggestion on intensive and incentive margins, I think yes, that is something we should definitely talk about. I think that would be something interesting for us to sort of explore. In terms of your suggestion of how we've incorporated other countries in the MFA, if we do something similar with tariffs that China has imposed on other countries, we can think about this. But the main reason why we included this variable for the MFA was because the exposure that Pakistan got was exactly at the same time as compared to other countries. The free trade agreement that China signed with Pakistan and other countries was not exactly at the same time. I'm not saying they were years apart, but not exactly at the same point in time. And for the IB, I think basically we use some set of regressions that we don't still have in the paper is we use these IBs for the demand shock and then we get back to demand shock on exports. It's still a work in progress, but this is something that we are considering. And for your questions, I think those are great questions for other additional studies that we may do after this, like looking at the impact of GDP and the number of jobs. Yeah, thank you. And to your point, credit availability and rent seeking, we haven't thought about that. We're looking at that aspect of credit availability and rent seeking, but definitely this is something that we should. For Dr. Bakar's question, how do we construct emissions? So basically, we have the energy usage, and there's some codes which are available from the International Energy Association. So they look at how for different units of energy usage, what their emission levels are. So we use that information to construct the emissions, and then emissions per unit is just dividing it by the output. So that's the idea. And for quality, again, I skipped the measurement of how we use quality, but it's Amit Khanwal's paper, and he basically has a nested loading model for identifying quality of the product using output prices and quantities. Complete nested loading model for all products, and then we sort of aggregate them at the firm level using recognition.
Thank you. Well, that was insightful. And now to the last session, the last presenter of the session is to Francesca Howard Kennedy School and try to make those bureaucrats and the Korean export.
Yeah, thanks for this opportunity to present my research here. Let me clarify. So the big motivation behind this project is in the research interest in industrial policy. There are a number of recent papers that try to evaluate the success of individual industrial policies or assess the economic conditions for industrial policies to be successful. But one thing that we often don't consider, we don't have good evidence of, is if countries have the capacity to implement a given industrial policy. So does industrial policies in fact depend on the capacity with which it's implemented? And in answering this question, I'm hoping to make a contribution to the literature on state effectiveness and development. In particular, does bureaucratic capacity matter for growth drivers? Okay, so the context that I'm studying and is particularly fascinating for this question. So South Korea, I'm studying South Korea between 1960 and 2000. In 1960, South Korea was poorer than most of Africa, whereas by today it has about the same per capita income as France. Exports were one measure of economic activity that grew particularly fast. You can see Korea Korean exports per capita relative to US exports per capita between about 1950 and 2000. And you can see this was below 100 in the late 1950s, and then it reached parity in the 1990s. And there are some other large developing countries here in the graph to see that this is nothing that is like super mechanical. It's nothing that just happens between the US and developing countries over this time period in general. So while all this action in terms of economic growth, in terms of exports is going on the left-hand side, so to speak, the government did a number of things that we consider kind of the right-hand side. They pursued a number of industrial and export policies, but of course, for many of them, there's not necessarily variation because it's just one South Korea that you're observing in the data. What I'm doing is I'm studying the people behind one such policy, and what I'm asking is that how much does this policy's effect depend on the individual bureaucrats that are implementing it? And in terms of methodology, I relate to other people that are trying to link economic outcomes, economic activity to individuals, in particular to managers of private sector firms. The bureaucrats that I'm going to be studying are going to be the managers of government offices. And let me give you a really brief overview. So the first thing that I'm going to now do is to tell you about the setting that allows me to identify how implementing capacity changes the policy's effect, what policy is this, and what are the bureaucrats that I'm going to be looking at. And then there are going to be 3 results with brief discussion of the identified assumptions. So if you're trying to understand how implementing capacity changes the policy's effect, there are 2 central and a few minor challenges. The central challenges are, the first one is that you need variation in implementing capacity while you fix the policy that you are studying. So what you would want then is you want the same policy implemented in many different locations. That's kind of the bread and butter of many applied micro studies. However, challenge number 2 is, well, I mean, it's a bit more challenging. Challenge number 1, even for something like industrial policy, which we often think of being implemented at the national level, when you don't end up having a lot of variation then you could look at this. Of course, many other things happening at the national level as well. So the second challenge is that you need variation in implementing capacity, but also when you fix the location where the policy is being implemented. Otherwise, implementing capacity, policy success can just be correlated because of some underlying similarity, right? Some simultaneity or variables. So a natural source of this type of variation in capacity of a policy being implemented occurs when bureaucrats move between locations while continuing to work on one and the same policy. And the policy that I'm studying is going to be the promotion of exports overseas by the Korea Trade Promotion Agency. And that agency was founded in 1962 with the single goal of increasing South Korean exports. Here you can see the offices that that organization had in 1962, and I'm going to show you the other offices they had a little bit later. So these offices essentially pursue activities in 3 realms. One is to write reports on market conditions, report on market demand. The second one is to link Korean exporters to importers in the countries where the offices are located. And the last one is to organize or facilitate the representation of Korean firms in international trade fairs. The main purpose of this slide is to show you how this policy is implemented in many different locations. So let me show that not. Okay, so this is the rollout of the policy to different countries. And basically when a country becomes colorful, that means from then on there's an office that exists in this country. It becomes colorful as soon as the first office opened up. And almost all of these countries, the offices remain active for the entire time period that I was studying. So we only have opening and very few closures of these offices. So you have, this gives you the policies being implemented in many different locations. The second part of this is, yes, the offices remain open over time. And here you have the example of the London office, which highlights that these country directors are rotated every 3 years. So we get the newspaper clippings of bureaucrat B1 being appointed in 1981, bureaucrat B2 replacing them as the manager of the London UK office in 1984, and bureaucrat B3 being appointed in 1987 to again replace them. And one thing that I haven't mentioned is that for the vast majority of countries, there's a 1-to-1 linking. There's exactly one of these overseas export promotion offices. And yeah, so even these three bureaucrats already give you kind of a lot of identification, a lot of connections between different countries. So bureaucrat B1, for example, I also observed this person in Bangkok, Casablanca, and in Paris. Bureaucrat B2, I also observed this person in Lisbon and Sydney. And bureaucrat B3, I also observed them in Frankfurt, Oslo, and Lisbon at different points in time, right? So at first in London, then Frankfurt, and Oslo, and Lisbon, for example. And this shows you that even these three bureaucrats already connect 8 different countries in this data set, which is very important for identification. So to preview the results, the main takeaway is that industrial policy needs good bureaucrats to meet the effect. The first thing that I show is that upon the opening of one of these offices, Korean exports increased by close to 40% in the few years after that happening. The key assumption behind this result is that these office openings don't target growing markets. And to give you a perspective of what kind of this 40% increase in exports corresponds to, so one important determinant of trade between two locations is the distance between them in a gravity model, right? So take the distance between, again, Seoul and London, for example, how much would you have to reduce that to get a similar increase in exports, where you would need to move London as close to Seoul as Mumbai currently is, approximately. So basically opening one of these offices reduces the distance between London and Seoul to what the distance between Mumbai and Seoul is. The second and really the main result is that one standard deviation increase in bureaucratability also gives you a roughly 40% increase in exports. And the key assumption in this result is that appointments are quasi-random with respect to underlying export trends. The last result is looking at what goes into these different effectivenesses of these bureaucrats, and that's looking at products where a bureaucrat doesn't experience from a previous appointment. And what I find is that when a bureaucrat is appointed, exports increase by 3% in those products where they are experienced compared to those products where they are less experienced. And this uses demand shocks during the bureaucrat's first appointment to get a first stage in terms of their experience. Oh, sorry. And the interpretation of this is that you can get some endogenous capacity growth depending on what you make your bureaucracy work on. But another word of calling that sounds quite positive, another way of referring to this is that this might be path dependence. So let me talk about the office opening effect first. This is the main result here. What you can see is that prior to one of these overseas offices opening, you see parallel pre-trends, and after the openings, you see kind of an accumulating effect that stabilizes after around 10 years. And if you transform this into a percent increase, it is about a 38% increase. The main concern here, as I hinted at before, is the targeting of these office openings, right? So that's kind of a big issue with all industrial policies, and this result is essentially just evaluating this type of policy. You would think they are very strategic. So what I have in the paper, and we can chat about that more, is that these openings don't seem to target growing markets. If you put non-Korean exports as an outcome here, you don't see anything. The second one is that if you look at kind of predetermined market size variables, these do a great job of predicting which country gets an office first. So if you look within Europe, we have a set of countries that are roughly the same distance from Korea, maybe both geographically but also in terms of height or other factors that people should be important. Then it's really the market size in 1961, so before this organization opens up, that predicts very strongly which countries get their first opening. So it doesn't look like time-varying factors strategically determine where they open these offices. So the second result is looking at how much these bureaucrats matter for exports. This is empirically, the first step is very simple, and I'm explaining an outcome variable, which is exports at the country product year level, using bureaucrat fixed effects, bureaucrat B, that is in country C in year T, as well as country fixed effects, gamma C, and I'm taking out kind of all the variation that is happens because Korea is growing over this time by including these product year fixed effects. And then you get out, and then I can plot the bureaucrat fixed effects, and kind of a somewhat naive thing now would be to look at a bureaucrat with a 50th percentile of effectiveness and compare them to a bureaucrat at the 75th percentile, and you can say, well, this results into such a change in exports. Well, if that was my headline result, I have a couple of concerns. The first one is that even if the bureaucrat fixed effects are estimated without bias, they are certainly going to be estimated with error. So if you're just taking the variance of these, or any kind of dispersion measure of these fixed effect estimates, you would overstate the importance of these bureaucrats. And the state-of-the-art way to address this is following climate co-authors, where essentially due to the leave one out connected set of, due to the very interconnected set of bureaucrats and countries that I have, I'm able to back out an estimate of the bias that you would get from just using the variance of these bureaucrat fixed effects, and then you get the headline result. So that is what I wanted to say, that in order to apply the effective climate co-author approach, you need a leave one out connected set, which, because I have 35 years in which these bureaucrats move between different countries, so many countries see many different bureaucrats, this actually contains 75 of 87. So essentially all the countries that had offices opening up for the end of the Cold War. And this gives you the headline result, where if around slightly less than one standard deviation increase in ability gives you a 37% increase in expense. So the second concern that you should have, if I was with this basic finding, is that of course the estimates of bureaucrat fixed effects are going to be biased if, for example, you are appointing a more able bureaucrat at a time when Korean exports to a particular country would be high for other reasons. So there are the three-year rotation of these bureaucrats give me two ways of thinking about that. So the first point is that we saw that the London office got a bureaucrat in 1981 and the next bureaucrat in 1984. So suppose that London saw increasing potential for Korean exports, increasing kind of underlying Korean exports starting in 1983. And because of that, you sent a great bureaucrat there in 1984. But what we have now is you have differential pretense. You should have introduced differential pretense. And given that sometimes this constraint would be binding, you would expect this to be true on average. And what you can see here on the left-hand side, it classifying these transitions into different tercites depending on the change in bureaucrat ability. And what you can see there is that middle or top tercite transitions compared to bottom tercite transitions don't have any differential pretrends. And that effects kind of in line with what you would expect upon the appointment of this new bureaucrat. So the second thing that is nice about this three-yearly appointment schedule, three-yearly rotation schedule, is that losing a bureaucrat B is determined 3 years prior to it occurring. Right, you're sending bureaucrat B there in 1984, and that you're already determining that you're going to lose bureaucrat B in 1987. Now, if you send bureaucrat B there for some reason, something related to what was happening in 1984, then what you would expect is that gaining this bureaucrat would have a stronger effect than losing this bureaucrat, because you just have much less discretion about when to lose this bureaucrat. And this is already the right figure, so what you can see is that the new bureaucrat's ability has symmetric effects to the old bureaucrat's ability, and so this goes against this story. So the main mechanism that I find is that good bureaucrats allow South Korea to tap into, or South Korean exporters to tap into import demand. And that relates to these offices' main tasks, which is to connect import demand and export supply, essentially, is one way of referring to it. So if in the previous graph you also allow for interaction of bureaucrat ability with underlying rich product-specific demand conditions, what you find then is that the effect of you, particularly good bureaucrat being appointed to France, is concentrated in those products that see increasing demand at that time. And I think I'm running out of time. Other things is that ineffective bureaucrats don't seem to be reappointed. So that is nice for a couple of reasons that I'm happy to go into afterwards. This is the main event study result regarding these bureaucrat experience, where, like I said, the instrument for bureaucrat experience uses changes in import demand during the bureaucrat's first appointment. This is quantitatively quite a bit smaller, but nevertheless very interesting. So to conclude, and maybe I just leave the slide here, let me say the first thing. I think something that's quite important here is that it appears that good and bad potential bureaucrats likely exist everywhere. So here you can have good and bad actual bureaucrats, or potential ones. And so putting the good ones in key positions may be something that matters quite a bit for economic growth. And kind of selecting out of less well-performing bureaucrats that I just very briefly mentioned is potentially a very interesting strategy in tasks with uncertainty. It's very hard to predict who's going to be doing well in this particular. And let me leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's a good question. We'll do it because I already have discussed it.
Okay, thank you for this. I enjoyed reading the paper. I actually read how closely the theme relates to things that we teach in so many of our courses: development economics, international trade, political economy, where of course the end goal is to achieve high rates of economic growth, and then the role that industrial policy plays in achieving high rates of economic growth. And this is interesting because there are so many examples of growth miracles where an effectively, nicely designed industrial policy was also effectively implemented. But then there are other disappointing cases where the industrial policy was not able to achieve the desired objectives. So this way, the paper fills a very important gap in the literature by identifying that one key factor that can play an important role in effectively implementing well-designed industrial policy. Okay? And that's where the state capacity comes in, and that's where bureaucracy comes in. And as economists, we have this image of bureaucrats as this group of individuals who are responsible for incentivizing certain activities, certain sectors. So a group of individuals who are responsible for incentivizing either sectors or forming those additional rules to make firms perform well, and then penalizing the non-performers. And so that way bureaucracy is deeply embedded in our society, and there is interaction between different layers of bureaucracy, okay, as well as politicians and the government and firms and the NGOs. This paper looks at the case of South Korea, which provides a nice setting where, given the timing and the nature of the appointments of bureaucrats and the growth miracle experienced by South Korea, and tries to link the two. So how much the effect of industrial policy during South Korea's growth miracle depends on bureaucratic capacity. And the paper shows that bureaucrats were important, state capacity was an important factor. There was a massive increase in exports, where these quota offices were opened overseas, and then it also sheds light on some of the mechanisms which helped these bureaucrats. So learning by doing, and also information transmission with trade fairs and some other factors. So the paper is divided into broadly three main sections. The first one, as Philip just explained, shows that there was an increase in exports as these offices were opened. Okay? And once again, the 3-year tenure for these bureaucrats and the process of reappointments that was very explained in a lot of detail in the paper shows that. The second part of the paper focuses on this bureaucratic estimation of bureaucrat ability. Okay? And it uses this bureaucratic component in the data lead, the bureaucratic fixed effects. First estimates that using a very rigorous method, and then tries to answer this question that how much of the variance in South Korea's exports was explained by differences in bureaucratic ability. Okay? So the question is, what makes an industrial policy successful? And the answer that the paper proposes is it's the bureaucrats who implement it. Now, the paper, as you're reading the paper, it sort of answers all the questions that you may have. What if there are parallel threads? What if the bureaucratic appointment process is it orthogonal to exports, for instance, limited mobility bias, anticipation effects? So over a 100-page long paper, it nicely answers all of those questions, and I think the referees are going to have a really hard time trying to come up with comments as to time. I still have a few comments that I'll talk about. Now I know that there's data limitation, and we don't know much about these bureaucrats in terms of their qualification or their ability or how motivated they were. The fixed effect that you estimate, it does sort of bundle all of these effects together. So hopefully for future work, it is important to see which of these aspects are more important than others. At the same time, we don't know anything, we don't know much about the reward mechanisms or whether the non-performers were penalized, compensation, things like that. So although you use a very rigorous way to estimate the bureaucratic component, there is still a lot of ideas for future work where you could look into, with the right data, what plays a more important role. The other thing is about learning by doing. So this is very interesting, especially also in the context of Pakistan. The paper does allude to this point towards the very end, where over time, over decades, not years, but decades, there was a shift from South Korean exports away from textile in the 60s towards steel products, towards electronics. So there are obvious means to specialization, but then dynamic gains over time, especially in terms of building exporting capacity. It is important to sort of highlight a bit more on what mechanisms were used to do market research, how motivated these bureaucrats were to adapt to changing market trends. And then the last main comment is how does the South Korean experience compare with others? So more generally, economists remain skeptical that it would be possible outside the context of a few East Asian countries where there are specially competing bureaucrats. They have significant autonomy, which is somewhat lacking in the Pakistan case as well. States that would effectively discipline the private sector. So the institutional context matters. Findings may not be entirely generalizable for other settings. But on the flip side, it does indicate that maybe you would expect stronger results for other countries, especially developing countries, where there's more room to build this state capacity and enhance bureaucratic capability. The policy lessons, of course, trade played an important role in the growth miracle that South Korea experienced. The correlation of experience and exports is also another interesting lesson. Give these bureaucrats some time to focus instead of trying to multitask. This is one area where multitasking is not good. So they should focus on particular areas, like the destination countries, as you mentioned in this case. Do more familiar tasks, and over time, this will help. And also, CEO-like bureaucrats, the term that's used in the paper, will have some autonomy. What about other types of industrial policies? If you look at the Chinese and the Vietnamese case, FDI was an important role. So this would, when you read the paper, you could think of, at least I thought of other policies, other roles where bureaucrats could play an important role, like creating local supply chains, manufacturing, FDI, and so on. And then to engage all the stakeholders. So going back to the diagram that I showed earlier, keeping firms at arm's length, this was an important component of South Korea's export success, that there has to be constant negotiation and renegotiation with the firms. The term that the literature uses is embedded, it's called embedded autonomy. So on one hand, you have to give certain independence and freedom to these bureaucrats to perform well, but at the same time, there has to be constant engagement with other important players. So all right, that's all that I have. Thank you.
Comments will be paper itself. It's very. I think for Pakistan, the commerce ministry and using this framework for we have 60 offices around the world. These commerce attachments and trade promotion. I think they have 3-year terms, so it will be quite fruitful. So with that, I'll open the floor for questions. Ask.
Thanks for the I found that fascinating. One is you've got 2 senior bureaucrats sitting here. One of them next to me is in charge of training. So I haven't read the paper, but I got a sense from what Zara was saying is that a lot of these are innate qualities. I think, entrepreneurs, etc. But I guess the one question is, can any of these, I'm going to imagine this is a fixed, some fixed innate quality which doesn't vary from bureaucrat wherever they end up. But is there any way one can affect that from a policymaker perspective? The second thing is what you really, and I think Zara was also talking about it, is, and I think you've done it, is the product targeting. Because in Korea, really focused on products. And I like the fact that you said, okay, if this bureaucrat went to another place, and if this bureaucrat, he or she had experience, I imagine most of them at that time would have been, had experience in this product, in a 2 or 3% increase. But there are also certain products which may fit that market very well. Like, London, they're importing this, so the Koreans are targeting this, and, the French are, importing a lot more of this, so the Koreans will target this good. Now maybe there will be some subsample of it just happens to work out that this bureaucrat has this experience in this product, and this is a really high growth product, demand-wise in that, and it'd be interesting to just wonder if that's it. And I guess the other thing is, I'm sure this is way beyond your scope of your current paper, but there's so much work which is also coming out, interesting work on Korea, and there is this idea about how they targeted lending also. So there's this huge thing about they gave a lot of credit to very specific sectors. So it wasn't just one thing. I mean, it was very interesting to look at the numbers. They didn't have a real competitive advantage in any of these products. But they just, they lent, they reduced tariffs on imported intermediate inputs, and then they really had this targeted strategy, which is, I think, as you said, the world is going back to its industrial policy, which is anathema for great people. Thank you.
Thank you. Great paper, and I heard it's around 100 pages long already. So I was just wondering, when we talk about the industrial policy, there are multiple policies. These are set of policies from the things. So one question that was coming in my mind was that were these bureaucrats really aligning with the state's other industrial policies? For example, one could be that the state is supporting SOEs, for example. So were these bureaucrats aligning when you're seeing differential growth in state enterprises versus non-state enterprises or private enterprises? The other one would be maybe, for example, if the government at the same time was having R&D support, for example, and you will see those sort of sectors actually expanding. In that case, you say that the bureaucrats are more aligned with the global set of industrial policies that the state was having.
Okay, one last question from the end there, please.
Even though the world market in general and the changes in global political conditions in particular, it can connectedly have any effect on the increase of exports of South Korea, regardless of the individual behavior of bureaucrats.
Thank you so much for these comments. Yeah, indeed, I think that the discussion was another paper in itself. I think that is a very good summary. I did not know about the Galbraith code. That sounds, that I will use that. So I think one thing just that some of the comments at the beginning make me think through is that one thing that where surely the external validity is somewhat limited is in the effect size, because we need to consider that effect size compared to the South Korean economic growth as a whole, right? We have this 50-fold increase in exports compared to the US. This is a 40% increase there, right? So just to put this in perspective, that is surely a function of that. So kind of talking about the determinants of bureaucratic capacity, I guess also some of the first questions went in that direction. So yes, it is unclear what goes into things do. And it's absolutely the central perhaps limitation of what I'm doing here. However, it is very interesting to think about penalization of non-performers here, because what I do find is that if you are in the left tail of performers, essentially during your first appointment, in this case where you can clearly be linked to an outcome variable, then you are much less likely to see future appointments. Now, I cannot tell you exactly that is penalization, that's a deliberate outcome. Obviously, those are people who didn't like the jobs, so decided to do something else. That's also a possibility, but nevertheless, it's in line with some of these. And I guess that's also one response to Azul's comment about, yes, so I don't have an answer, I don't have much to say about what you should change in terms of training or similar, except perhaps that experience and practical experiences are important. I cannot, there is something about innate or not immutable qualities of these bureaucrats that we need to check for whether that is plausible in some results that were not presented today. But I think it is very interesting. So if you did take that very seriously, then one potential takeaway really is that the selection is quite important. And how do you select people? That is very hard. Ex ante probably, perhaps impossible. So one way of resolving this is by essentially running low-stakes projects where you're experimenting. I didn't go into great detail there, but you could think that among these 87 countries where they have these offices, perhaps half of them are not necessarily breaking even by themselves, but are important training or experimentation ground for them. And I think there are some things to be learned there for other potential settings. Yeah, so I think I need to make it straight. Yeah, I think the time variation is very interesting about static gains to specialization, but then of course dynamically you don't want your bureaucrats to only be good at promoting text styles, which is what they would have learned early on. And I do indeed see, this relates to another comment, I do see an interaction between what those bureaucrats are doing and or what this industrial policy is doing and other industrial policies that Korea is pursuing, and that goes again to Azim's point. Kind of what I was considering a lot at the beginning was the product target. Because there's a well-received paper by Nathan Lane that is looking at Korea's heavy and chemical industries drive, which took place in the 1970s. So kind of after a few years of the policy that I'm studying here. So one thing, first of all, to say is that the policy that I'm studying is somewhat orthogonal to that, because we're looking at variation between countries. We're taking out kind of all the things that happen to, say, steal for Korean exports to all countries. So that's one thing to say. The other thing that I can see is that the number of reports these bureaucrats are writing on textiles really drops off a cliff in 1972-73, which is the time when the government went from saying, we want Korea to export more, that's kind of the only outcome we care about, it doesn't matter which products, to we actually do care about which products, and it's not textiles anymore, because we see textiles like the way it is. So that's very interesting. So regarding some of the external validity of this study, it's very important. I have many countries on the map, but it's a within Korea study, right? So yes, definitely you could consider that some of the characteristics that make Korea special, like Confucian history or something like that is important. Two things regarding it. So the first one is that in the 1960s, international and Korean observers did not have a very high view of Korea's bureaucratic capacity. So there's somewhat of an exposed rationalization to seeing East Asian countries with this tradition growing and having high state capacity today. It's not how people perceived it in the 1960s, both within and outside of South Korea. The second thing is that, yes, this Confucian tradition, you could think that leads to kind of less autonomy and perhaps more rule following or something like that. And given that, the fact that I find these large differences between individuals is perhaps something that you would expect to translate, at least to this extent, to a sentence. I do think it's interesting, the comments that were made about these bureaucrats being less engaged in multitasking than some other bureaucrats. So they have this very clear outcome variable, which kind of relates to them being CEO-like. But I think that's potentially something that's quite interesting about this Korean experience as a whole. They had, for much of this time period, it was a military dictatorship, actually, but the military dictator between 1961 and 1979 happened to be obsessed with this one outcome variable that was exports, that is both measurable and potentially we would think not very detrimental or even positive, which led the whole state apparatus focus on like an outcome variable that may be a beneficial one. That's an interesting consideration that my paper doesn't speak to, but it's something to think about. Yeah, I probably need to wrap up. So, and then also mentioned targeted lending in South Korea, which was actually something that before I started thinking about export promotion, that is something that I was thinking of trying to get data. It turns out that governments have less of an interest to tell you which companies they are lending how much money to and what they're doing with that, than they have with kind of telling you where bureaucrats are promoted that are there to be intermediaries between foreign buyers and local firms, because that is information that you need to make public. So that's one reason why I didn't go down that road. One other comment regarding the discussion. So I thought the reference to embedded autonomy was very fascinating. This book by Peter Evans that is looking at South Korea and some other countries, a qualitative political economy book. That is indeed the direction that kind of some of my current research that I was just working on before coming to Pakistan is going, and I would love to chat more about that. That was very passionate. Yeah, so I did talk about the other industrial policies. Regarding R&D support that the Korean government was doing, yeah, so that's interesting. That's definitely something that's perhaps quite relevant in the later part of this time period, let's say the 80s and 90s, not so much perhaps in the 60s and 70s. But I think it relates to So I did report the interaction with demand conditions, kind of better bureaucrats or better products that see increasing demand at that time. Which is still a comment about the way being posted, how does that interact with local conditions. The other thing is that the same applies to supply, by which I mean Korean exports to other countries. So good bureaucrats are good at promoting steel at a time when Korea is increasing its steel supply to other countries as well. And that is, I guess, related to all kind of other policies that Korea is pursuing, which includes R&D, which would be steel specific, I suppose. Yeah, I think that was the last comment. Sorry, what was that? Global political conditions, surely important. I think Korea at that time was very special, had a very special relationship to the US. The Cold War was important, clearly, and letting aside these officers. Economic and political conditions have changed, and yeah, just technology has changed, so those are really important things to consider.
Considering your vision 100-page paper, I should thank you all. So thank you very much for 3